This is a repeat of the keynote address that I gave at the 2017 CISSE in Las Vegas, Nevada in June. The presentation was not recorded and not everyone was able to attend, and I was asked to record it to preserve the material. This is that talk, my reflections on the state of InfoSec education. So my talk today isn't really on slides. I generally don't like to do slides for talks such as this. Instead, I want to give some thoughts and reflections on where we've been and where we're going. I gave a talk on basically this general topic at this same colloquium in 1998. And I was going to try and use that as an opening to this talk, but when I looked, I no longer have a program that will open the presentation I used in 1998, although I still have the speaker's notes, which I used to construct this. I think the inability to recover something from even 20 years ago is actually somewhat related to the concept of the talk today. But I will say that looking through, there are a number of items that are really similar to what I did back then. And I would like to also say that some of these points are generalizations. They don't really necessarily apply to some of you, but I think in sweeping terms for those of us in the field who are conducting education, setting standards, these do apply to the majority. So part of that, certainly, you can think about the aspect that each one of us likes to think that we're an above average driver. Some figures show that something like 85% of drivers believe they're in the top 50% of drivers. And so certainly those of us conducting education in this domain may suffer from that same kind of bias. As with many of my other talks, including looking back at that one from 20 years ago, I find that not only do many people believe that what I say doesn't apply to them, but many of the warnings and suggestions I make aren't really heeded, and that's sort of the curse of Cassandra. So if you were present at that 1998 talk, you may recognize some of these items. Let me start by conducting a little quiz that you can just take yourself. It's not something to be graded on, but do you know who Bob Abbott was? Have you ever used any of his research in your classes? Do you know who Bob Courtney was? Do you know any of Courtney's principles and why they apply to security? Do you know what GEMSOS or SCOMP were? What they were based on and what they were notable for? Have you ever actually read or used the tan book, the light pink book, or the green book from the Rainbow series? And if you don't remember the colors, the tan book was audit, the light pink book was covert channels, and the green book was on passwords. How many of you know what Tunix was or who was involved? How many of you have ever programmed OS code on a capability-based machine? Or can even name a couple capability-based machines that were in widespread use? So, 19 years ago, when I gave the keynote, just to get some little context, 2 years before that, the first ransomware had appeared. And 2 years before that, the first major distributed denial of service attack occurred against the service provider Panix. It's Panix, using a SYN flood. At that time, I had done a survey of universities around the U.S. using some data from NSF and my own connections, and found that there were really only 4 major institutions in the United States that had any kind of information security, computer security educational program. And of those 4, we were graduating on average 3 PhDs a year, one of whom normally went to industry, one of whom normally went to his or her home country outside the U.S., and maybe one of the three would go into an academic position somewhere. So we weren't really meeting much demand. There really wasn't much infrastructure. And 98 was really a pivotal year in a lot of ways. The solar sunrise events occurred in 1998. DNSSEC was first proposed and put forward. Interestingly, we still don't have it fully adopted. 1998 saw the appearance of remote operation tools like NetBus and Back Orifice. And it was a time of major kinds of DDoS attacks, worm programs, and other kinds of break-ins. So in 1998, we really were becoming acutely aware of the problem with various kinds of what we now call cyber attacks. But we didn't have much in place to provide any kind of academic educational response, and even from a commercial point of view, we didn't have a lot of response. So in 1998, when I talked about this, I talked about the need for all of us to develop a new discipline that wasn't really a part of any other discipline, that it met the special needs of the new field. And that meant more than just in the computer science and computer engineering realm. It also meant that we had to understand elements of psychology, for instance, of law, of economics, communications, and a number of other disciplines that normally are not even considered as related to CS within an academic environment. We needed to develop a standard body of concepts, of our own literature, of our history, of our terminology, and our metrics. All of those are characteristics of a well-defined academic discipline, and in 1998 we certainly didn't have those. I would argue that to some extent we still don't have those. Security isn't a discipline yet. We're just not there. And even within what we're trying to do, we're out of balance. We don't really understand the relationship amongst the aspects of what we do that are science, which is understanding the possible, what things are possible to do, with engineering, which is how do we cost effectively build and deploy solutions, to technology of how do we use what we already have to solve problems. Those are not well integrated. We don't understand how those relate together for security. And that's part of why we haven't yet gotten to the point where a discipline. In fact, I would argue we don't even know what to call ourselves. Some of us, we call ourselves cybersecurity, cyber defense, cyber operations, information warfare, information security, computer security, network security, information assurance. Wow, and the list goes on. But what about privacy? Don't we care about that? I think we do, for most of us who work in this area. So where does that fit in? How about forensics? We have to worry about determining what happened and who did it. How about operations? How about a list of other possibilities? What really is part of our field? What is our field? If we can't agree on that, we certainly aren't a discipline yet. We don't have basic terms yet that we agree on. Many of us teach the old triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And if we go back and look at where that came from, that really wasn't designed carefully. That was developed more as a throwaway for a sales presentation, and it stuck. Those are not independent concepts from each other, and they don't really capture everything that we want to capture. I think Don Parker's Hexad is closer, but it still leaves out issues, for instance, of privacy, risk, non-repudiation, and a number of other important concepts that we want to teach. So we don't even have a unified set of terms or metrics. As Bill Murray has pointed out repeatedly, we often confuse the idea of threats with vulnerabilities with attacks. And so long as we can't even agree or understand what those terms mean as independent entities and how they relate to each other, again, we aren't at the point yet where we have a common vocabulary. Metrics. Well, if we don't really know what we care about, then we can't know how to measure them either. And if we can't measure them, we can't show improvement, we can't show differences among different approaches. So that's a problem. Many of the things that we care a lot about are actually relative, but we're not entirely sure what they're relative to. An example of that is privacy. Privacy is a very relative concept, relative to not only to societies and laws, but to individuals. How about risk tolerance? That tends to change from place to place. Availability. How do we measure that? Is it continuous? Is it a discrete variable? Is it averaged? All of these things may be relative to a particular environment. If we don't understand those, we can't measure them. And because we can't measure them, we can't make decisions, and we have difficulty in showing the suitability of various approaches, one against another. What we end up doing, unfortunately, is making decisions on the basis of what we can measure: cost and speed. We can tell you if one system is more expensive than another. We can tell you if one is faster. We might be able to tell you if something has more cores or more memory, but those aren't security properties. So if we don't have measurements of security properties, then what is it really that we're doing? How about standard references? Pretty much every field has a set of standard references. We have some in computing we can certainly point to. We have Knuth's books. We have the old Dragon book for compilers, for instance. But what do we have as a series of standard literature for what we have? Most of the books we have are related to computer science. They're related to building software, building network defenses, and cryptography. Where are the standard references on things like physical attacks, network attacks at the physical layer? Where do we have things about personnel screening, management, and insider threat with psychology as part of the standard characteristics that we want to teach? Where are issues of calculating risk? What standard books do we teach in the field as part of our security education? Where do we have references that talk about how to do appropriate backups? How do we do disaster recovery? How to do we planning for disaster recovery? Those are really part of security too when we look at continuity of operations. I have yet to find a small set of books that cover all of this material in any meaningful way. I would say that we don't have a body of literature that we can all point to and agree is our own and defines our field. We aren't even consistent about our known history as to where did we come from and who are we. When I started off this talk, I asked you some questions about some pioneers in the field and some pioneering publications and systems. They're probably not taught in your curricula. Very few seem to, and it's hard to find them mentioned in any of the standard textbooks. If you were to teach a course in cryptography, I'm pretty sure that you might start off by teaching about Visionaire's polyalphabetic cipher, maybe Lord Playfair's transposition. Pretty much everybody talks about Caesar ciphers. None of those are used today, but those are all traditional classic ciphers. They're generally well known, and they're presented in almost every textbook. So why don't our students know about the rich history of vulnerability classifications and discovery, about OS structuring, architectural design, the pioneering work of people like Anderson and Abbott and Schell and Schroeder and others? Why aren't those part of what we would normally teach as we move forward in making students aware that this is a rich field with a rich history? As a challenge to all of you, what I would suggest that you might want to think about as you structure your courses and your instruction, take a look at some of the lists of the pioneers. There are places like the NIST, National Computer Security Center, Computer Systems Security Award, or the Cybersecurity Hall of Fame, or the ISSA Hall of Fame. Look at some of those names. Think about what those people did and why they were selected, and then teach that to your students. Let your students know that this field just didn't spring up in Silicon Valley 10 years ago. It isn't only about viruses and firewalls. It has a rich history of individuals who have been working in the field for nearly 50 years now and coming up with solutions and ideas many of which have been relegated to the dustbin of history because they weren't effective at the time. But they are foundational to what we do today. If you think about that, and you think about the other points I've already raised, realize that we aren't teaching a discipline in most institutions. Instead, we're teaching a set of work skills. We're teaching students what they can use over the next decade to secure systems and keep a job. But generally, and particularly at the undergraduate level, we aren't doing a very good job conveying the fundamental knowledge that is going to last a career that could go 50 years or more. We're too oriented towards basically teaching a trade and not a professional discipline. We teach them what to do, but not how necessarily, and definitely not why. Think about that. If we were really interested in a profession, in a discipline, then part of that would be putting forward not only understanding those basics, but encouraging them to join professional institutions, to be teaching them how to do continuing ed and to stay current in their fields, and to be able to distinguish between hacks and fundamental knowledge. Our students should come out of our programs able to learn new skills in their areas with minimal to no supervision. Machine language and reverse engineering are examples. They should have exposure to those so that when they come upon a new language that's been compiled down into malware or on a new architecture, they shouldn't be at a complete loss. They should have some idea where to start, how to teach themselves what they need to do, and how to get up to speed to be productive in the field. If you've had any kind of more formal study in education and you look at Bloom's taxonomy, too much of what we teach is at that very lowest level of remembering and recall. We aren't doing enough about teaching the material that requires analysis and evaluation. When we focus too much on skills and not enough on knowledge and attitudes, we produce people who may be able to hit the ground running, but they aren't able to keep that pace throughout the progress of their career. Not simply those aspects of software and hardware and people. We aren't really getting at some of the fundamental issues that define how a discipline, how a profession operates in a social context. In particular, we should be doing more to teach about ethical thought. Right now, we have too many people in the field who blame the victims, and that's completely inappropriate. We shouldn't be blaming people for using systems the way they've been marketed and the way they understand them. Most people don't have computing knowledge, so they use things and believe that they're operating correctly. When faults occur because we either built the systems poorly or because we didn't instruct the users on how to best protect them, we shouldn't be blaming them. Blaming the victims is clearly something inappropriate and something that a professional shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be forcing people to have to worry about management of patches. Again, they don't have that kind of training. That's not something that we do in any other field where we regularly force people to do upgrades and patches on what they purchased and are operating in good faith. Something's wrong with that from a professional point of view, from an ethical point of view. The fault is really, in many cases, here with the design and not with its application, not the way they're using it, but in the way that we've sold it, the way we present it, the way the user interfaces are written. We've done a very poor job there. We also have done a very poor job of understanding privacy and safety and how those get built into our products and how we tell people about how those are used. If you think about why do these problems occur, well, part of it is because an awful lot of our systems that have been put out there have been really poorly designed. They've been designed to get out there and be first to market. The idea is that whoever gets their product out there and dominates the field first is the one that's going to be successful. And as a result, we have lots and lots of organizations that produce code, push it out before it's well tested or ready, and then depend upon user complaints and patching to somehow catch up. That's not appropriate, and that's certainly not with security as a fundamental design issue. We don't have strong law enforcement in this arena for a number of reasons, in part because the paradigm in which we use the technology has been so revolutionary that the law hasn't had a chance to catch up, and we haven't had enough professionals who understand the field being involved in the area of helping law enforcement. Those in government who really are focused on this very often just focus on the offensive aspects rather than on the defensive aspects. As a result, we have an awful lot of work and emphasis that goes into finding flaws and weaponizing them, and not as much really as building fundamentally sound systems. This even carries over to the idea of applying patches, because patch systems, or better yet, unpatched systems, are going to be vulnerable to those kind of attacks. We have to change our mindset as security professionals if we're really going to be a profession that moves forward in any kind of cohesive way. Think about how we might compare ourselves to other fields that have been developed over time and have a little bit better approach. Think about medicine, for example. Medical professionals don't spend their time seeing who can be the fastest to respond to the next influenza outbreak or measles outbreak, or who's going to come up with the latest poison discovery. Those are really antithetical to their whole design. Instead, they look at issues how to prevent disease, how to help people live healthier lifestyles, how to counter those things that are discovered after research to actually be problems rather than trying to develop them. Several years ago, 5 years ago actually, I wrote a blog post about how this thinking has permeated some of our competitions that we use. And I'll read you here part of that blog because I think, I believe that it is illustrative of some of the thinking. So, there's another barn on fire. Quick, get a bucket brigade going. We need to put the fire out before everything burns. Again. It is getting too tiring watching all our stuff burn while we're trying to run a farm here. Too bad we can only afford the barns constructed of fat wood. But no time to think about that. A barn's burning again. Third time this week. Hey, you people over there tinkering with designs for sprinkler systems and concrete barns. Cut it out. We can't spare you to do that. Too many barns are burning. And you, stop babbling about investigating and arresting arsonists. We don't have time or money for that. Didn't you hear me? Another barn is burning. Now hurry up. We're going to have a contest to find who can pass this pail of water the quickest. Yes, it's a small leaky pail, but we have a lot of them, so that's what we're going to have to use for this contest and this fire. The winners get to be closest to the flames and have a name tag that says Fire Prevention Specialist. No, we can't afford larger buckets, and no, we can't get a hose. Now get over there. We need you in line. The barn's burning. If you think about that as an example, that's what we're doing with contests and teaching right now. We are seeking the people who can put out the fire the fastest. We are seeking the people who come up with the latest tools to put out the fire. And we're not really sparing enough effort or consideration or really making central the fact that we should be designing so we don't need those problems. We should be training people to prevent them and to investigate why they're starting. That just isn't the way it works. Now, I don't mean to imply by this that all competitions are bad, but I really think it's important that we step back and think more about what we're doing as a profession rather than succumbing to really the kind of seductive air of getting all these people together, getting their adrenaline up, and awarding winners. Because not only are those competitions organized towards somewhat narrow skill sets, they can be really discouraging to those who don't excel under pressure and a sense of competition. I know many students really don't like the idea of competing in an environment like that, and yet have wonderful ideas. I have seen from my own experience that that also has a tendency. There are many women and minorities who don't like to get out there in front and be part of a competition environment because their day-to-day academic experience is all too real a competition on a regular basis. If you read some work in psychology, you find there are different kinds of thinkers and learners. I would recommend to you Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow as an example. If we're to make progress as a field, we have to embrace lots of different kinds of thought, lots of different approaches, and focusing so much on the idea of finding those people who can find flaws, stop attacks, those competition, high-pressure kinds of events, is likely to actually discourage some of the individuals that we really need to have in the field. We also have to reevaluate some of our sunk costs. As a field, we're responding by using the technology and teaching to the technology rather than trying to lead with new technology. Why is that? Well, right now there's this huge sunk base for the Unix, Linux environment and for Windows. And we're developing a huge sunk cost base in iOS and Android. So as a result, all our solutions are on those platforms. When was the last time you saw a capability architecture that was really deployed as a secure system? When was the last time you saw a new architecture that had different virtual memory organization, like a Harvard architecture, or used multiple processors differently? Instead, what we have had happen is that the security solutions that have been put forth by vendors and that we have been really teaching to involve layering. We have containers on top of virtual environments, inside virtual machines, on top of multiple virtual processors. We no longer know what we're running, what's underneath what we're running, and whether there's any other better ways to do it. There's something wrong with the discipline when we only respond to what's on the market instead of spending more time thinking about what is possible and what's a better way to do it. Market pull is a part of this factor. We don't teach, for instance, good secure programming, and certainly we don't teach formal methods, because that would be too difficult in most programs. Our students would find it too challenging, and furthermore, when they went to work, they'd never use it. Much more important that we teach them the latest web programming techniques, for instance. So we put in those web design and big data, and AI now is the latest thing. And those are in the curriculum, and students learn those rather than more of the fundamentals like secure coding. When the market's biggest need is to find and fix flaws, to discover where vulnerabilities are and issue patches, that's where our programming tilts. That's the kind of development that goes on. We don't really have an environment we're teaching our students that is aspirational. That should be the case for a development of any kind of software. We don't teach them the kind of processes that should be in place. And unfortunately, if we do, we don't have enough employers who want to hire them. We need a major change here, or we're going to continue to be, after the fact, building patches. And I think that's part of the problem, is the situation may be getting worse. We found that governments, in general, are not really good about cooperating on cybercrime investigations or defensive programming because they're worried it takes away their advantage or their ability to work against crime or work against other nation states. In fact, in many countries, they want to weaken the protections. They make it against the law to have strong encryption, or they're trying to, as an example. This is not something that's going to lead to a better environment for us to be developing or teaching. And at the same time, we see exploding around us the Internet of Things, cell phones, and everything moving into cloud computing where it's potentially more vulnerable. What's the solution that many people are putting forth? Blockchain. Well, that's not a solution. That's a whole new set of problems, not to mention the environmental impact. Within our own community, we have this incredible competition for funds and for prestige. Here at the CISSE, we're a little bit more collaborative, but it still doesn't carry over on a regular basis, and we don't do it enough outside. There aren't sufficient resources, and we don't do a good job helping boost each other and move in a direction as a profession of a collection of professionals. Meanwhile, those of us who do more advanced research are seeing reduced support for research. It's more conservative in the kind of results, and there tend to be more restrictions on who can be involved, particularly U.S. nationals. There's a citizenship imbalance not only in our student population, but in our faculty population and where our students go. There's mistrust of the supply chain growing because that hasn't been something that we've been teaching. We don't have the tools or the structures in place to have better confidence in our supply chain. The criminal elements are getting bolder. They're stealing more. They're actually setting up companies and inserting themselves into the marketplace and the supply chain. And many of them are being supported by national entities, by national governments. Where is our level of response back? And what are we doing as a profession to try to change both the mindset and the technical field? So I put forward to you that if we are going to be a profession, and we are certainly not there yet, the last 20 years have perhaps been a start, but we need to set an agenda going forward. And these are the things I think we need to do. The first is we need to define who we are. What is our field? What is within the scope of our field? What are the terms and what is the common body of knowledge? And I say that with small letters. I'm not talking about the CBK that's been put forward, for instance, by ISC squared and others, although that may be a starting point. Until we define our field, it's going to be difficult for us to teach it, to measure it, or to write about it. We also need to define what are the properties of those elements that are really within the scope of what we do. Once we know the properties, we need to come up with some standard metrics. We need to come up with some standard terminology, some standard educational materials, a set of standard readings that everybody is familiar with, a set of standard books, a knowledge of a history of where our field came from. We need to get a balance back between the research part about what is possible and how to solve problems, and how those relate to the current environment. Some of the research is really just advanced engineering for current products, and some of the research is very abstract and there's not a clear path to where we need to be. Part of that is because we haven't defined the field. That's something we need to bring back into balance. I hope this has given you some material to think about. 20 years ago, I had a vision of where we could go, and I wasn't the only one then. I've been able to bring some of it about through my own efforts at education at one institution. Others here have also made progress in this arena. But as a field, we really haven't pulled together. We haven't defined it. We don't have a vision. We don't know our history, our terminology, our measurements, our literature. And we really need to change that if we're going to make a difference in the future. So let me challenge you now. That's what you need to do. That's what we need to do. Because I really don't want to be in a position of coming back in 20 years and giving this same talk again. Thank you.